I'm joined now by our panel of MPs to discuss the mission. Jack Harris is the NDP defence critic, and he joins us from St. John's. Marc Garneau is the Liberal Foreign Affairs critic in Montreal, and here in the studio with me, James Bezan, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. First question to you, Mr. Bezan. What did the Prime Minister mean when he said last fall that Canadian forces would not be accompanying Iraqi forces to the front line, that they would be behind the wires training?
Well, I think we had a pretty good description what the military term is for combat. And we were strictly there in an advise and assist role. We're not in a combat role. Our troops were at the front on a few occasions now where they've been fired upon, and of course they fired back and defended their positions and were able to eliminate those areas that were shooting upon them, as well as Iraqi security forces.
But Mr. Harris, the Prime Minister was pretty categorical about the fact that Canadians commandos would not be on the front lines, would not be accompanying Iraqi forces. In fact, you've raised the issue in the House of Commons because you say you've asked the Speaker to rule whether the Prime Minister misled Parliament, because they actually are now on the battlefront.
Yeah, and I think all these attempts by Mr. Bezan and others to try and square this circle really does reinforce the idea that we were misled when we were told this wouldn't happen. Because remember, at the time, there was concern, and the Prime Minister himself raised it. Canadians do not want to have boots on the ground in combat in Iraq. And we were assured that that wouldn't happen, that we wouldn't be playing a combat role with our ground forces. And that's clearly what's happening. He also said they would not accompany them. And so, you know, how you can get around that when we've clear evidence from the military itself that they spent not just a few times, but 20% of their time on the front lines. They're calling in airstrikes. I've been told by senior military officers, former ones, that this is clearly a combat role. When you're at the front line, you may as well have a weapon if you're shooting a weapon, if you're actually calling in airstrikes with your own efforts. So, you know, this is a combat role, and this is totally contrary to what Canadians were told and promised. And is a real issue of trust here. Mr.
Garneau, you served in the armed forces. Do you think that we're in a combat role or semi-combat role when we are accompanying Iraqi troops to the front line, using laser guided to mark targets for airstrikes, and engaging in firefights with ISIS militants?
Well, certainly by my definition, that is combat. We tried to get some clarification yesterday at the committee meeting, and I specifically asked the minister, what does assist mean? A very vague term. What does accompany mean? And I also quoted a definition in the military dictionary that actually defines combat operation. I was not impressed or convinced by the explanations given by the minister or by General Lawson, who I think was trying to twist himself up like a pretzel to answer the question, but certainly did not answer it to my satisfaction.
Okay, so even the Chief of the Defense Staff, General Tom Lawson, said on committee on Thursday that he could understand why people would think that they're involved in combat, because it looks like it's combat, but the dictionary meaning of it isn't combat. But I mean, as Paul Dewar, the NDP Foreign Affairs critic, says, if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's got to be a duck.
Look, we're over there under parliamentary approval. The operation that we're conducting, Operation Impact, respects the spirit and the intent of the motion that Parliament passed. And I can tell you that our troops are over there, they're training, they're assisting, they're providing command and control, they're doing military planning. And that's when they are at the front, is when they're doing the military planning to enable Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga to take on a more active role. Now, they're not there fighting alongside them. They're not the tip of the spear. They're behind, watching these things prevail. Unfortunately,
but as you said, they're fighting alongside them.
No, they're not the tip of the spear. They're not fighting. They're providing them with the advice and the assistance and the planning to go ahead and be successful in carrying out their mission.
But Mr. Harris, let's contrast this with the Americans. The Pentagon says that their military advisors, their trainers, are not out on the front lines, that they're behind the wires, and that they would need to get approval from the president before they're able to do this.
I think that's pretty clear. I mean, they stated that specifically. That was consistent, in fact, with what we were told. We were going to have an air combat mission, I think, which was passed by Parliament, and that the other component was to be a training mission. The Americans have been very clear that even incidentally, they do everything they possibly can to avoid that kind of combat. Canada has seemed, and that seemed to be agreed by the Prime Minister's statements in the House, by what General Lawson told CTV back in October, by assurances given to other reporters services that we wouldn't be at the front line, and now we're in that role. And I think General Lawson is turning himself into a pretzel to try and define it away, doing the job that the Prime Minister should be doing, and admitting that he didn't tell us the whole truth at the beginning, or changing this mission. You know, so we've got a problem here with trusting what our government is telling us in order to get permission and authority of Parliament to go ahead with this, and then what they're doing on the ground. And I think that's it's worrisome. We worried about mission creep. We worry even more about what might take place next without Canadians knowing about it.
The point of Mr. Lawson, Mr. Bezan saying, in fact, last fall to me that, you know, it would be semi-combat if they went out and marked targets, so they wouldn't be doing this, and now it's completely changed. So, I mean, Canadians have the opposition have a point here that you guys have been saying one thing and then doing something else.
Let's make sure people understand the facts. First of all, you know, we're the ones that completely came forward in full disclosure that our troops were under attack, that our troops were out there and assisting with the Air Task Force, with our CF-18s and other allied coalition partners, and making sure that their precision-guided bombs are falling where we want them to fall. And, you know, Matthew Fisher wrote a very interesting article in the National Post this week that talked about, you know, what Special Operation Forces are doing in the United States and Britain.
Well,
and I think
but the Pentagon says that's not true, that they are not, their special forces are not
draw that
doing
to your attention,
that.
and I can't speak to what other governments are doing with their Special Operation Forces. But, you know,
well, you brought up the article,
I know, but
the Pentagon says that's not the case.
Yeah, but
so,
on Special Operation Forces might be something to look into. It's an interesting observation and some intel that he had.
Mr. Garneau, let me ask you something. The Pentagon says that they don't think that marking targets is particularly effective in any case. They say that the large number of airstrikes that have taken place have not been used by people painting targets. In fact, they say they're not doing this, and again, they would have to get approval for it. So, are we making a mistake by even going out there and endangering the lives of our Canadian Special Forces by marking targets and running the risk of getting killed by Islamic forces who are firing on them?
Well, it's clear to me that our Canadian Special Forces believe that it is effective, that it improves the odds of actually hitting the right target. However, you know, in my party, in the Liberal Party, we actually supported the involvement of the Special Forces right from the beginning.
That's why you voted against the motion.
Because they were going to be able to, going back to last September, they were going to be able to train in a non-combat capacity and advise the Peshmerga. That was the agreement that was originally made. Now, I just noticed that Mr. Bezan has talked about we're doing things in the spirit. Well, there's another vague term, in the spirit, assisting, accompanying. The government has not been clear. Now, if the government had come to us beforehand and said, our special forces are going over there, they will be advising behind the lines, they will occasionally go up to the lines to perform targeting of specific targets to help with airstrikes, they will be doing this, they will be doing that, we would have been able to make I think we would have been certainly more aware and not surprised as we were finding out now that they actually have been doing this since last November. I think that is the right approach that should have been taken by this government.
All right, gentlemen, I want to thank you all for appearing. It's been a great discussion.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Okay.